To the west of where I sit in the evening are the grassed-over banks and ditches of Oakwood Fort, built by a cohort of 500 men, a mixture of cavalry and infantry, under the overall command of the great general Agricola. Watched by the hostile native kindred, the Selgovae, squads of imperial soldiers dug ditches, built ramparts, and laid out roads and a signal station. Through a depression in the ridge of the deer park, the men at Oakwood could look east and see the signal station built on the summit of Eildon Hill North, above the sprawling supply depot at Trimontium. For only one generation, 20 years, the Romans marched up and down our little valley, filing intelligence reports, skirmishing with the warbands of the Selgovae, laying down the controlling framework of a new province for the empire. But then in AD 100, the Emperor Trajan withdrew troops from Britain for his invasion of Dacia, modern Romania, and the frontier was pulled back to the line of the Tyne and Solway. And perhaps in triumph, the Selgovae warbands burned the wooden gate towers at Oakwood. Ownership of a gentler sort was discovered on one of the sheepwalks in the deer park in 2003. Part of an Ogham stone was recognised. Ogham was a strange and ancient tree language which formed its letters like the branches or twigs of a tree, cut in straight lines like runes, but arranged on either side of a central trunk. Usually spelling out personal names, probably the marks of the ownership of land, the earliest Ogham stones were carved in Ireland in the 4th century AD. The finding of a stone so far east in Scotland is striking. Perhaps evidence that Gaelic-speaking chieftains were carving out holdings in the centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire in the west, the centuries known as the Dark Ages. Not far from where the Ogham stone was picked up, a ditch runs up the slopes of the deer park and across its summit. In places, the ditch has been hacked out of the hard whinstone rock that lies close to the surface of the rough pasture. An immense labour. The ditch and the bank on its eastern side must have demarcated an important boundary. By the early 12th century, it was certainly used as part of a fence. On top of the bank, what was known as the park pale was built. Palus is the Latin word for a stake, and it later came to mean a row of stakes, a fence. The phrase beyond the pale derives from it. Since a badly frightened deer can jump an 8 or 9 foot fence, the pale had to be high, and the ditch immediately in front of it made even higher. Hunting was an obsession with medieval Scottish kings, and the deer park lay next to a royal castle at Selkirk and at the eastern end of the vast game reserve known as the Ettrick Forest. In early winter, deer herds drove pregnant does into the park where they could be fed through the hungry months. Once they had dropped their fawns in the spring, the does and their young were released back into the forest. It was a traditional use of the hill that lasted into the middle of the 20th century, when deer were still kept there, browsing the rough pasture. West of where I sit, backlit by a setting sun, the fields rise gently towards an eminence that looks down over the confluence of the rivers Ettrick and Yarrow. Below it there is a place name that remembers bands of men who rode north in search of riches and land. The Hartwood Burn suddenly splashes over a very picturesque waterfall known as the Mott Linn, and it remembers what was once a Mott and Bailey castle built on the hill above at the behest of Norman adventurers, many of whom were granted land by David I of Scotland in the first half of the 12th century. An old, well-made track leads up the flank of the hill, and, especially on horseback, it is easy to see the nettle-covered remains of the outer bailey, its ditch, and the higher mound of the motte that once rose up behind the palisade. No record of the lord who caused this earthen wooden castle to be built has survived, but when the sun dipped behind Huntly Hill and food and drink were served to him and his retainers, they probably described the landscape around them in Norman French. Gurgling past the little standing stone at the bottom of the garden, the common burn marks the southern boundary of the farm, and it took its name from the common land owned by the borough of Selkirk. From the 16th century onwards, these large holdings gradually shrivelled as surrounding lairds encroached. But every year, a long cavalcade of horsemen and women ride the bounds to the north of the town, and every 40 years or so, they trot along the southern bank of the common burn to check that no boundary markers, like the little standing stone, have been moved. With a standard-bearer carrying the town flag, the common riding stirs ancient memories. From a distance.